I grew up in a house where silence was louder than any shout. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me, it was just that love was never spoken. There were no raised voices or slammed doors, no daily battles that echoed through the halls. No, the noise in our house was more insidious, more subtle. It was in the cold glances exchanged between my mother and father when they thought I wasn't looking, in the long, uncomfortable pauses that stretched between sentences, and in the unspoken rule that emotions had no place here. My mother had a very particular view of the world. To her, everything had to be efficient, done on time, and under control. And that included me. She didn't believe in nurturing or babying. There was no room for weakness. She had a mantra she'd often repeat: life won't coddle you, so I won't either. It was said with such certainty, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. I learned early that any sign of vulnerability was unwelcome. If I needed help, I learned to keep it to myself. She wasn't cruel, though. She was just pragmatic. Always busy, always moving, always organizing, making sure everything around her was perfect. But there was a quiet cruelty in the way she ignored the emotional side of things. There was always a distance between us, one that I didn't fully understand, but felt deeply. I would watch her run her hands through the dishes or fold laundry, her movements so precise, while I sat in the corner, trying to make myself small, trying not to take up too much space. My father, on the other hand, wasn't cruel either. He wasn't cold, but he was absent. Physically, he was there. He came home from work every evening, ate dinner with us, and went to bed at the same time every night. But emotionally, he was far away. I would try to talk to him sometimes, but he always seemed preoccupied. He would nod at me when I came home from school, ask if I'd done my homework, and then disappear into his study or sink into the couch to watch the news. I learned quickly that my needs didn't matter to him. If I cried, he didn't ask why. He would just turn the volume on the TV up a little louder. There was one memory that stuck with me more than the others. I was about 8 years old when I fell off my bike, scraping my knee badly. The pain was intense, and blood was running down my leg, but when I limped inside to my mother, covered in dirt and tears, she didn't even look up from the sink. "You're fine. Get a wet cloth and stop fussing," she said. That moment is when I understood, no one here would care about my feelings. Emotions weren't welcome, and it didn't matter if I was hurting. I quickly learned to bottle everything up. I started to pretend, even to myself, that I was fine. By the time I was in my teenage years, I had become an expert at hiding my feelings. I smiled when I didn't feel like smiling, and I said, "Thank you," when all I wanted to do was scream. On the outside, I was everything my mother wanted me to be, perfectly controlled. But inside, I was a mess, a storm of emotions that I didn't know how to navigate. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was emptiness. A sense of being invisible in a house full of people, of never truly being seen for who I was. And so I kept going, because that's what good daughters do, right? I think somewhere deep down, I started to believe that maybe I wasn't worth caring about. If my parents couldn't see me, maybe I didn't deserve to be seen. As I entered my teenage years, the house became even quieter. The walls seemed to close in around me, the silence pressing harder against my chest each day. I wasn't sure when it started, but somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to reach out. I stopped expecting my parents to see me, to care. The absence of their attention became something I lived with, something I learned to fill with the noise of my own thoughts. I became adept at pretending everything was fine, at being the perfect daughter, obedient, quiet, efficient, just like my mother wanted. But inside, something was changing. I started to feel this gnawing emptiness that I couldn't explain. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something I didn't know how to put into words. It was like I was fading away, slowly but surely. And no matter how many times I smiled or did the right things, the hollow feeling didn't go away. I remember the first time I tried to talk to my mom about how I felt. I was 13, and the sadness had been weighing on me for weeks. I didn't know what it was or why it felt so heavy, but I needed someone to acknowledge it. So, I sat at the kitchen table one afternoon, watching her chop vegetables with her usual sharp precision, and I quietly said, "I think something's wrong with me." She didn't stop chopping. She didn't even look up. "Did you fail a test or something?" she asked, her voice flat and dismissive. I shook my head, and for a moment, I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. How could I? I didn't even have the words. So, I just said, "No." "Then you're fine. Teenagers are all moody." "It'll pass," she said, as if it was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. That was it. No questions. No curiosity. No concern. Just the cold reassurance that my feelings were nothing to worry about. I could almost hear the lock clicking shut inside me. From that day on, I didn't even bother trying to ask for help. I buried everything deeper inside, locked it away, and threw away the key. I started keeping journals, filling them with half-thoughts and poems that didn't make sense, trying to find an outlet for everything I couldn't say. I even dyed a streak of my hair blue once, thinking that maybe, just maybe, something small could make me feel a little less invisible. But when my mom saw it, she barely flinched. She called it attention-seeking, and made me wear a headband to cover it at a family gathering. "What will your grandmother think?" she asked. Always, it was about appearances. About what others would think. Never about what I needed. Never about me. And so I started to shrink further into myself. My outward appearance became something I could control, a mask I could put on so that no one would notice how lost I felt inside. At school, I did well, too well, in fact. I became the model student, the one who got straight A's, who was praised for everything she did. But it wasn't because I loved learning. It was because I needed something, anything, that would make my mother proud. I was so desperate for her approval that I started to believe that achieving perfection was the only way to get her to notice me. But no matter how perfect I became, it was never enough. "Good job," she'd say, her voice always flat. "But you could have done better." Or worse, she'd ignore it completely. I would watch her, waiting for her to say something, anything that would make me feel like I mattered to her. But she never did. The more I tried to succeed, the more I felt myself fading into the background, as though I was never truly seen. By the time I was 16, I had mastered the art of being invisible. I had perfected the act of being what everyone wanted me to be, and no one knew the difference. I wore the clothes my mother approved of, ate the meals she cooked, and smiled when spoken to, even when every fiber of my being wanted to scream. I was quiet, controlled, and efficient, everything she had trained me to be. But inside, I was dying. I think by then, I had already stopped trying to connect with her. It hurt too much to keep reaching out, only to be met with a dismissive shrug or a "you'll get over it." I stopped talking about my feelings because I knew she wouldn't listen. So I kept them locked away in the drawer I'd created inside myself, the drawer that had everything I couldn't say, everything I couldn't feel. At school, things didn't get much better. I had friends, but I was never really part of their circles. I was always on the outside, laughing a little too late, smiling a little too hard. I tried to fit in, to make connections, but it felt like I was wearing a mask that everyone saw, but no one ever looked behind. I couldn't tell anyone what was really going on in my head because I didn't even know how to explain it. My friends had their own struggles, their own dramas, and I couldn't be the one to unload mine on them. So I kept going through the motions. I studied, I smiled, I made small talk. I was perfect, or at least I seemed perfect. But it was all a lie. At home, my mother continued to praise me for my accomplishments, but it was never enough. No matter how hard I tried, she always found something more I could do, something I could do better. When I didn't meet her expectations, I felt worthless. And when I did meet them, I felt nothing. She never showed me affection or love the way I wanted her to. It was always about what I could do, never who I was. I tried to get her attention, but it was like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. I remember the time I tried to show her my journal, the one that held all my secrets, all my thoughts that I couldn't voice. I was 16, and I thought maybe if I shared something personal, maybe she would finally see me. "I've been writing," I said, holding out the journal. She glanced at it, then back at her phone, her eyes flicking with impatience. "Is it any good?" she asked, not even bothering to look up. I felt the sting of rejection, but I swallowed it down. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think so." "Good for you," she said, before moving on to the next thing. The journal was never opened again. I stopped trying after that. I realized it wasn't worth it. She didn't care. She didn't want to know me. I was just another task to be completed, another responsibility on her never-ending list. By the time I was 18, I had learned to ignore the ache in my chest, the loneliness that I could never shake. I went through the motions, just as I always had. But now, there was a new layer to it. I started to feel like I was living someone else's life. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Who had I been before I had learned to pretend? Who was the girl who wanted to be loved, who wanted to be seen? That girl was buried, and I had no idea how to bring her back. And then, one day, I overheard something that would change everything. It was my mother on the phone with a friend, speaking in the kind of tone that said everything without saying anything at all. She was talking about me. "Dasha's very smart, but a bit emotionally high-strung," she said. "Like a little drama queen." The words hit me harder than any slap ever could. I wasn't just ignored or dismissed anymore. I was labeled. I was the problem, the one who made things difficult. She wasn't seeing me for who I was, she was seeing me as an inconvenience, something to be fixed, something that needed to be quieter, more controlled. That was the moment I realized, she would never see me. Not the real me. Not the girl beneath the mask I'd built for her. By the time I was 22, I had perfected the art of pretending. I had built a life that looked impressive from the outside, everything in its place, everything on track. I had the perfect grades, the perfect job, the perfect apartment. My mother approved. I spoke to her every weekend, answering her questions with rehearsed answers, as though I were reading from a script. "Work is good." "Yes, I'm eating properly." "No, not dating anyone. Just tired, you know." I had become the picture of someone who had it all together, the kind of person you would look at and think, she's got it figured out. But what no one saw, what no one could see, was the weight I carried. The exhaustion. The ache in my chest that wouldn't go away. I had learned to say, "I'm fine," so many times that it didn't even sound real anymore, not even to myself. Every time someone asked, "How are you?" I would smile and say, "Great, just tired." It became my only truthful answer. But deep down, I wasn't just tired, I was broken. I was numb. I think I had stopped knowing who I was a long time ago. I had buried myself beneath all the roles I played: daughter, student, employee, friend. Everyone saw the person I wanted them to see, the person who smiled and nodded and went along with everything. But no one asked the question that really mattered. No one asked, "Are you okay?" because they didn't know what to look for. They didn't see the parts of me that were suffocating, the parts that had never been allowed to breathe. And when it came to relationships, it only got worse. I was terrified. Terrified of anyone getting too close, of anyone seeing the cracks I had carefully hidden. When someone complimented me, I would shrink away, as if their words were too much to bear. If they asked what I wanted, I froze. I didn't know what I wanted. I had never been asked that question before. One boyfriend, he was kind and patient, once told me, "You're like a locked box. I don't know how to love someone who won't let me in." I cried quietly in the bathroom after he left. Not because I didn't want to be loved, but because I didn't know how to let someone in. I didn't know how to accept love, or even if I deserved it. At 25, I reached a breaking point. I couldn't do it anymore. The weight of pretending had become too much. The exhaustion was physical. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was waking up in the middle of the night with panic attacks, and during the day, I was numb. It felt like I was floating outside of my own life, disconnected from everything around me. I had always told myself that I had a good childhood, that my parents had provided for me, that I should be grateful. But now, in the stillness of my apartment, alone with my thoughts, I realized how broken I was. The truth was there, hiding in the corners of my mind, and I couldn't escape it any longer. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I started therapy. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone. I knew they wouldn't understand. In fact, I was sure they would dismiss it, just like everything else. But it didn't matter anymore. I was doing this for me. The first time I sat in front of the therapist, I couldn't even explain what had brought me there. I just stared at the floor, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. But she asked me a simple question that I had never considered before. "When did you first learn that your feelings weren't safe?" I didn't have an answer. Not at first. But then, like a floodgate opening, the memories came rushing back, the dismissive looks, the silence, the times when I had needed someone to see me, and no one did. That was the moment. The moment when everything I had buried for so long began to crack. For the first time in my life, I cried. And I didn't try to stop it. I wept like a child, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I didn't expect it to happen the way it did. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed door or final shout. No grand confrontation or angry words exchanged. It wasn't anything that could be pinpointed or traced back to a specific moment. It wasn't even a decision I made consciously. It was more like a long, drawn-out realization that one day, I couldn't keep pretending anymore. The first step came gradually. I started to pull away from my parents, little by little. At first, it was just a few missed phone calls, a delayed response to texts. I'd tell myself I was busy, that I had a lot going on, that I was tired. But the truth was, I was just exhausted from pretending to be someone I wasn't. Every time they called, every time they asked about my life, it felt like I was suffocating. The walls of their expectations were closing in on me, and I couldn't breathe. And then, one morning, I woke up to a text from my mother. It was the kind of message I had received 1,000 times before. "Why haven't you called this week? Don't be so selfish. We worry." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. My fingers hovered over the keys, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. I had always been the one to reassure them, to make everything seem fine, to apologize for needing space. But this time, something inside me snapped. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even disappointed. I just felt empty. For the first time in my life, I realized how much energy I had spent trying to meet their expectations, trying to be what they wanted me to be, and I was done. I had nothing left to give. So I didn't respond. The next day, I didn't call. And the day after that, I didn't check in. The silence between us grew longer. But it wasn't the kind of silence that had existed in my childhood, full of tension and unspoken words. No, this silence was different. It was mine. It was my choice. A week later, I blocked their numbers. I unfriended them on social media. I erased their email addresses. It felt like I was stepping out of a cage I had been trapped in for years. I took a deep breath, as if for the first time in my life. It felt terrifying, unnatural, like I was doing something wrong. But it also felt like freedom. Real freedom. I didn't do it to punish them. I didn't want to hurt them. But I realized that I had spent my whole life in their shadow, trying to please them, trying to be someone I wasn't, and I couldn't keep living that way. I had to create space for myself to heal. I had to stop looking for approval from people who would never truly see me. It wasn't easy. It never was. There were days when I wondered if I had made the right choice. I missed them, in some strange way, not them, exactly, but the parents I wished I had. The ones who would listen, who would ask, "What's wrong?" and stay to hear the answer. The ones who would apologize for the hurt they caused and want to understand. But that wasn't who they were, and I had to let go of the idea that they ever would be. In therapy, I asked my therapist one day, "What if I'm wrong? What if I made it all up in my head?" She looked at me, gently but firmly, and said, "The child you were doesn't need you to prove it happened. She needs you to believe her." And for the first time, I did. I believed her. I chose her. I chose the girl who had been ignored for so long, the one who had learned to hide her emotions, to shrink herself to fit into a mold that wasn't hers. I chose to believe that she deserved love, respect, and the space to be who she truly was. And I promised her I wouldn't let anyone, not even my parents, take that away from her again. 2 years have passed since that day. 2 years since I cut off contact with my parents. There are still moments when I miss the idea of them, the fantasy of parents who could love me without conditions. But I know now that grief doesn't mean you've made a mistake. Grief means you've had to let go of something you never truly had. Now, I am learning to live for myself. To laugh without it being a performance, to cry without guilt, to take up space without apologizing. I am learning to say no without feeling like I owe anyone an explanation. I am learning to exist, fully and completely, without hiding. It's not easy. I still struggle with old habits, with the fear of being too much, with the shame of needing love. But I'm getting there. For the first time in my life, I'm living on my own terms. And that, I think, is what freedom feels like.
You know, it's strange. I've always heard people say that silence speaks louder than words. But I never understood it until now. I feel like I've been reading about myself, but from someone else's perspective, like I've been living in my own silent bubble, wearing a mask, pretending everything is okay when it's not. It's haunting, really. How the smallest things, the things we never speak of, can eat away at us from the inside. That moment with the mother, where she dismisses her daughter's feelings as just mood swings, I don't know why, but it hits so hard. Like I can feel it in my chest. You expect to be seen, to be heard, especially when you're struggling. And when that doesn't happen, when your pain is just brushed aside, it's like you're not even there. You stop asking for help, stop wanting to be seen, and then it becomes a habit, a part of you that you can't shake off. And then, therapy, I can almost hear the relief in that first cry. It's like all those years of holding it and just break open in an instant. I don't know, there's something so powerful about that moment. The pain doesn't disappear overnight, but at least it's real now. At least someone sees it. But then, the decision to cut ties with her parents, it's almost like an act of survival. A painful, necessary step. I've been there too, caught between wanting to hold on and the reality that holding on to something that doesn't nourish you is like holding on to a stone in a storm. Sometimes the most freeing thing you can do is walk away, even if it feels like you're abandoning a part of yourself. You're not. You're protecting it. And that last part? Learning to live for yourself, damn, that's the hardest lesson. It's not just about breaking free from your past, but also about finding out who you are when you're not trying to please anyone. It's terrifying, but it's also beautiful. I don't know, it just makes me feel like, maybe we all need to learn how to take care of our own hearts before we can give them to anyone else.